to this computer. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this interview. What I'm going to be doing is asking you a couple of questions regarding the environment and things such as environmental conservation and restoration. First, I would like to start by asking you, have you heard of environmental conservation?
I don't think so.
Okay,
It
if you
sounds familiar. I feel like that's one of the uh things that we went over in like elementary school science.
okay, if you had to define it, how would you define environmental conservation?
Like
It can be a basic answer too.
like protecting the um like protecting the trees.
Okay, awesome.
Like the Lorax. Isn't the Lorax an environmental conservationist?
I think so. I think that's a good example. So, yes, environmental conservation is going to be the premise of trying to conserve and protect the environment in various ways. There are different areas of environmental conservation and also environmental viewpoints. So, there are certain things such as anthropocentrism, which involves having a human centered view. And that's going to be basically this viewpoint of humans are going to be the center of the environment and everything in the environment is meant for them. So when you have some things in an anthropocentrism view, that's going to be an item where you might view conservation efforts a little bit differently based off of how you value the environment. We also have things such as biocentrism, which is going to be an item such as everything has an intrinsic value. So humans have a right to protect these items because they have intrinsic worth, and they can help and support us. Um, Additionally, there's things such as ecocentrism, which is looking at ecological systems, and we need to preserve them as a whole. And then another example would be something like deep ecology. And deep ecology is going to be something along this like spiritual connection that people believe they have with the earth, and kind of going through all these different viewpoints shows how, with environmental conservationism, you might view how to conserve things differently. So, with anthropocentrism, you might look at it and say, hey, um, humans are the center of all the earth. So, things are at my disposal. Versus if you have items such as biocentrism, you might look at it and say, hey, this has an intrinsic value. I need to protect it because it has some sort of worth, some sort of value. And then things such as ecocentrism, looking at um, the item as a whole, looking at the ecosystem and seeing how these things interact and the moral considerations of that. So there's a lot of these different considerations that you can look at when you're thinking of the conservation. But yeah, a very basic answer would just be saving the trees, depending on how you that viewpoint is. So that
Save
viewpoint
the
would kind of,
trees.
yeah, be
Save
something
the
like
beavers.
yeah. So biocentrism would be kind of an example of that, or even if you went more extreme ecocentrism, thinking about trees and their impact within that environment, and etc. Um, so, based off of environmental conservationism, we have another subsetting that would also be something called environmental restoration. Have you heard of environmental restoration?
Not in that wording, but I feel like what is there's a brand that there's a brand that when you order, I'm sure there's a bunch of brands that do that, but like when you order something from them, they're like, "Oh, every time you order something from us, we turn around and plant a tree."
Okay. Yeah. So,
Is that kind of like that? I've never heard the terminology, but I feel like I'm seeing that more often, so I'm a little more familiar with the restoration.
yeah. So, it actually started
That's
back
it. Yeah.
in the very, very, very early, like end of the 1800s, early 1900s, with a man named Aldo Leopold. And he came up with this idea of having environmental restoration. And so it's looking at this larger view of there is the environment, and we have this right to protect it, and we have this necessity to protect it. But then also looking to make sure that whenever we are having our practices and we are embarking on our things such as utilizing the land, building different things like that, we're considering the effects that that could have on there, and also seeing, okay, what can we do to advocate and support the land in a way that while we may be working to, an example would be like plow the land, build on the land, what are we doing to restore it? So um, looking at it in a way of not necessarily kind of like the version of what you said is like, yes, planting the tree would be kind of that restoration of, in at one point maybe there were trees in an area, but because deforestation, different things like that, all of those trees are now gone. So it's going and restoring the environment in a way to what it was. So there's this idea that humans play a role in both damaging but also rebuilding the ecosystems or restoring the ecosystems in certain ways that sometimes with building and development we might destroy certain ecosystems. So I know from my personal experience in a metroplex, seeing buildings go up, taking different ecosystems where maybe like coyotes live or bunnies, and now they don't have some place to live. So the environmental restoration would look at an idea of going into that area and possibly taking maybe a place where a building might have been and nobody's renting that anymore, taking that back, restoring it in the best way possible to the environment that it was prior to having this development or taking it over from this ecosystem that was already existing there. One of the key items of this restoration, though, comes from a man named Robert Elliott, who kind of was a secondary support and kind of not contradiction, but questioned Leopold's viewpoint and saying that while we can restore things, there are limits to it. So, and that will kind of lead into my next question too, but there are certain ecosystems that maybe it's been destroyed and we might not be able to get it back. So there's limits to how much we can restore it, or even if we should restore it to what it might have been, and if that would benefit or even work well for that environment. There's this also key component of authenticity. So do you want to have that environment to just be restored and kind of brought back, or would you prefer to have that authentic environment? And can you even match that authenticity, or is that environment going to be able to function at the way that it was because it's no longer what it originally was? So there are a couple components of that environmental restoration and different historical viewpoints. And as you brought it forward to modern day, these also companies that are kind of enacting these restoration policies that you can tell with trying to plant trees and trying to restore the trees that have been taken down by development and production and things such as that. So that was an awesome idea for how we can see it today. My next question is, have you seen any areas local to you that have been impacted by conservation or restoration efforts?
Local to me? I don't think so. I don't think I've done enough exploring here in this town to to
Um,
know.
well, in that case, have you seen any conservation or restoration efforts in your previous towns you've lived in? Or if you can't think of any, how does that make you feel that you haven't been able to, that you haven't seen any, or have you even thought about it, that there haven't been any? There's no wrong answer.
Yeah, I don't like the last couple of towns that we've lived in have had they've been lake towns.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a bunch of lakes around here, and then the town before this was a huge lake town. So it was there wasn't a lot of restoration there. It was more protection,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, has been more than anything else, but everything has just been centered around the lakes and the bodies of water and things. So there hasn't really been a whole lot of restoration that I've seen. It's all just been kind of protected.
Yeah, which also is interesting too that you say that, because with the idea of the protection, that's kind of, that can bridge into an area of, sometimes you can see environmental groups that are protesting or fighting to ensure that there is protection for areas that are currently existing. So different bodies of water, like you were talking about, different environmental areas like forests, sometimes even in more developed areas if there might be areas that have yet to be developed, trying to protect those. With that, have you seen any, or in kind of seeing those protection efforts, any kind of extreme groups supporting that or trying to?
Not here.
Okay.
Um, no, it's a little too rural out here for big protest groups.
Yeah,
Um,
I feel like in the rural areas too, especially like in Texas, there's a lot of kind of that ingrained trying to conserve, like have conservation efforts, but also protection efforts for
yeah,
land and the environment and ecosystems while developing it. But there's also a lot of undeveloped land and ecosystems around too.
yeah.
Um, awesome. So in terms of that, so you haven't really seen anything. Is there anything you can kind of think of that maybe you wish there had been conservation efforts that have been put in place to either um, keep an area as is for the benefit of, the ecosystem, the animals that you witnessed, or anything like that?
You know, there is a little tiny, I guess it I guess it's small enough that I think it would count as like more of a playa lake than an actual lake, but there is a little community like this entire little playa lake is surrounded by houses and there's like no there's no break
Mm.
between the like development onto the water. Like I don't know what kind of like wildlife was there before,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know where they went when
Mm-hmm.
all of that. So I was like, I kind of wish that there was a little bit less human impact right there on the lake because the lake would be nice to go sit and look at without looking at suburbia at the same time.
Definitely. I know there's an area near me where there is a recent development, and I appreciated the fact that there is a walking path that's made of cement, but they were able to set apart next to it. It's kind of like a creek bed area that's has some growth and everything, and they put up signs that specifically notify the surrounding area that that's a wildlife conservation space. And so they left that space for any wildlife in the area to be able to go reside and also keep that balance with the community and saying, hey, while you're over here, please be cognizant that there can be snakes, there can be rabbits, there can be coyotes, and that is okay. And this space is for them, which I really
They were
appreciate.
here first.
Yes.
You are intruding.
Yes. And I know personally that's something that I've seen in this area a lot, especially at where I used to live. That we had some coyotes attack, and we've seen them prevalent over there just because this whole area has been where coyotes and rabbits and probably snakes, I haven't seen them, thank goodness, have lived. Um, but yes, so on the topic of kind of that protection side and kind of talking about protective groups and not seeing them, I'd be curious to get your opinion. So, what are your thoughts on kind of environmental groups and environmental protests?
The environmental groups and I'm actually like working with like developmental entities and things and like protecting whatever said environment it is. I feel like those are good. Those are good entities to have. Yeah. The ones that just stand outside of like construction sites with pickets and
Mm-hmm.
protest, I feel like is not a effective,
Mm-hmm.
very effective protest. I feel like they're never taken seriously and it doesn't really end well when
Yeah.
you get a whole
I
bunch of
can
different
say, yeah,
people
and I feel like those ones are some of
out.
the more extreme ones. And yeah, there has been,
Yeah.
kind of showing that with certain protests and environmental activism and yeah, specifically environmental activism, that sometimes those that have the more extreme tactics are going to be the ones that sometimes are less receptive to individuals, um, just due to the extremes that they might go to, and also that their viewpoints might not be shared by you, and so it's harder for you to understand where they're coming from, and especially when they're doing these extreme things that um
I feel like
you
don't get
might
the point across
yeah
as
you
well
might
as
not
they think it would.
yeah you might not see the benefit, especially when you mention them working with other groups and trying, so maybe working with the recent build and trying to work to support um environmental efforts and restoration and conservation in those ways. Um, so specifically for restoration, that is going to be again this idea that we are working to either try to restore an area, or while we are taking the area and possibly developing it, doing different things, we can try to make sure we are bringing it back to what it was, or different things like that. So with the idea of restoration, do you think that restoration could be a good idea, or do you think that there could possibly be some loss because it's not as authentic as it used to be?
It's I feel like it's a good idea. For the most part, you're never gonna get it like 100% back to what it was.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like you can get it, like 80, 90% back
Definitely.
to what it was. So I feel like it's a worth it effort,
Mm-hmm.
but you're never
And
going to be able to get it back
definitely.
to what it is,
And what do you
honestly.
think about the what possible costs could be associated? So there's a lot of times where when we have these developments and things happening in certain areas, we have that cost of the development, but then there's also this associated cost with trying to get an environment back to the way it was, which can kind of impact, it's almost like a double cost. Like you've had this cost for the area to take it down, and then this cost to develop it. And now you're having to put that money in to
Just undo everything
undo
that
it.
you just put in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, how would you feel about possibly like your, if you're living in that city or however that works, have your, going towards that funding and trying to get environments back to the way they were?
Feel like that should have been considered before the the development was done.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you didn't think it was going to be a successful development, go a different direction.
Yeah.
Because it would be pointless to put in all of the time and money and resources to develop something just to turn around and put all of the time and resources back to just undoing everything. So
Definitely.
instead of doing it twice, go a different direction and do it once
Yeah.
and do it a little more successfully.
Yeah. And so with that, do you think for conservation efforts, do you think it should be a necessary component in development? So having some sort of conservation ideas or conservation component tied into development of cities or towns?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, so kind of one of my last questions that I think would be fun to ask is what is kind of what kind of would you align with in terms of an environmental ethics viewpoint? So as I had mentioned before, anthropocentrism is going to be something where you view humans as being the center kind of everything, and you view that everything is around us to serve humans. We also have biocentrism, which is looking at all living beings and seeing this intrinsic value to them, and it's going to be our obligation to protect them. There's also the ecocentrism view, which is going to be looking at the ecosystem as a whole. And so that's going to be things like the water, the soil, the air, and seeing that those things also have value. And it also considers things like the organisms that are within the entire ecosystem and how we affect them. And then there's also like deep ecology, which is going to be that more holistic and kind of the ecocentric philosophy tied together. And it's going to be it's a little radical sometimes, but it's deep and spiritual in connecting nature in how humans live and relate to the environment. So an example would kind of be like those, a little bit like those protests you're talking about, things like that.
Like like the entirety of Pocahontas.
Mhm.
That's exactly what I think of when you say that. I love that movie. But no, I feel like the I don't remember what word you said it was, but option number three, or the
The ecocentric.
everything, yeah, like everything plays a vital role, and we should be aware of our place in it and be
Hmm.
able to protect the bunnies that can't protect themselves
Definitely.
from the humans or the, machinery.
Yeah. And I think definitely too, like, especially being in a state where there's a lot of like growing and a lot of produce and a lot of farming, that's a big thing too, is like the consideration of things like the soil and the air and the water. Like, there's a big component of that.
The farmland.
Yes,
Conserve the
definitely.
farmland.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for hopping on, talking about conservation and restoration. And if you ever have any questions, I'd be happy to talk about it in greater detail later too. So,
Of course. I will
thank
come up
you
with something, I'm sure.
so much. Have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you, and you too.